more carbon than it used to, and plants for a long, long time have obviously taken up that carbon and put it in their biomass. All right? And that's carbon fixation from the atmosphere into the physical structure of the plants as carbohydrates. Much of that carbon that they take up every day goes right back in the atmosphere because they respire. So most of the carbon is going quickly back and forth, and on the poster here you see big arrows going from the plants back to the atmosphere. So there's a lot of carbon flying around, so to speak, all right, and we're trying to look for relatively small amounts of carbon that gets fixed in the plant and somehow retained either in the plant or in the soil sediments where the plant lives, and that's sequestration. So the carbon that doesn't get returned to the atmosphere but is put away in storage for something on the order of 50 years or longer is what I consider sequestration. That's carbon that's out of action. Okay? If this were a tree, and the botanists amongst you will know this is not a tree. If this were a tree, the relevant pool for carbon sequestration is the wood of that tree, because that is almost certainly out of cycle, in storage for at least 50 years, maybe longer. Obviously, if you cut the tree down and burn it, then it's back in the atmosphere. But a living tree on the landscape, that carbon's out of action. Measuring that carbon, there are well-established, fairly standard methods for doing that that have been applied broadly. People are working on better methods, but that's relatively straightforward to determine how much carbon the tree has put away in its wood. In agricultural soils, and you'll hear about this later, the source, the place carbon gets stored is down in the soils underneath the plant. Okay, so much of the carbon that is fixed by the plant and would be sitting here at this time of the year might well be harvested, taken away, eaten, and eventually that carbon is returned to the atmosphere. So it's not a long-term storage. The long-term pool for sequestration is in the soils under the plant, and you'll hear more about that from the Ag Working Group. In the case of wetlands, the additional and pretty well understood place for carbon sequestration storage is burial in the sediments under the plant. So again, much of the carbon that's stored in the plant during the year gets respired back to the atmosphere. At the end of the year, the leaves, etc., decompose, the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. Some fraction of what gets fixed by the plant winds up getting buried as new sediments are deposited in the wetland. And if you get it deep enough, that carbon is put away for probably more than 50 or 100 years. Okay? So what's indicated over here is for forests, ag soils, and wetlands, there are 3 different places we're looking for this sequestered carbon, and they are either well-known methods for getting at where that stuff is or not so well-known methods. Okay? But that's what we're trying to do when we talk about sequestration. So let me talk first about what we know about sequestration in wetlands. There's no question it happens. Wetlands accrete, they accrue sediments, and so some of the deeper sediments are put away below the depth at which they're no longer active and returned to the atmosphere. One of the key assumptions that I've made here today, and we all need to make when we talk about wetland sequestration, is how deep is deep enough? 5 or 10 centimeters, 2 to 5 inches is clearly not deep enough. If it gets down a yard, a meter, it almost certainly is. So for the example that I've worked out today, I assumed half a meter, half a yard. All right? And I'm saying when carbon is buried to that depth, it's out of action. It's out of circulation. All right? But that's an assumption, all right, and can be tested. The other key assumptions involved in this estimate are how fast are new sediments added on top, because that's the mechanism for burial. By adding new sediments on top, you're sort of pushing sediment out the bottom, down into that layer at which it's no longer active. So how fast is that sedimentation? All right. For the wetlands in the Hudson, we know the range. It's sort of a centimeter at the high end to probably 3 or 4 millimeters per year at the low end. And so that variability will give us variability in how much carbon gets sequestered by individual wetlands. The third thing that you need to know is for that layer, if you think about the layer at depth that's about ready to move down into that storage, and it's not a bright line or anything, but think about that layer at depth that's about ready to move down below my 50 centimeter mark. What's the organic matter in there? How much carbon is in there? Because that's the amount you're pushing down into that sequestered pool. All right? And again, we know what some of the numbers are like for the wetlands. And for the example I've worked today, I'm assuming is 2.5% organic matter, but there's a range. The figure you see here shows the variability in both the accretion rate, how fast sediments are deposited, and what that is. And so you can get a range of sequestration rates. The number I came up with, sort of a sensible middle of the road, is 2.5 metric tons per hectare per year, which is on par with forest sequestration in this region. The thing about the wetlands, there aren't nearly as large an area of wetlands as there are forests in the Hudson Valley, or most places in the continental US for that matter. And so we know forests are the big player, but wetlands per area are contributing about as much as forests, I would say, based on what we've known so far. There are obviously co-benefits to preserving wetlands and making sure they're there in the future. But it looks like carbon sequestration is going to be a benefit that's worth tracking into the future. Whether it becomes worth trying to market is a different topic that we could talk about later today. So that's where we are on sort of the wetland part of things. Numbers are pretty well known, and it looks like there's something there that we really ought to be paying attention to. The estuarine part, and this is largely work that Malcolm Scully from Woods Hole has done. He's interested in the open water of the Hudson River itself, the estuary, and what happens to carbon once it gets into the river. Your other handout shows a rough carbon budget that we've put together, and the important elements of this budget are that most of the carbon that gets into the river comes from the land. It's not produced within the river. It's not plants growing within the river. It's carbon coming from the land. And most of what comes in from the land is respired within the river. There's no burial, there's no sequestration that occurs within the main stem of the Hudson River. And so what that means is that once you move carbon off the land into the water, it's essentially guaranteed to get back into the atmosphere. There's no place to put it and hold it for 50 years or longer. So from a practical point of view, what that means is that we should be doing things to keep carbon out from eroding from the landscape into the Hudson River. And this ties in well with these good agricultural practices we've been hearing about all day and for the past few years. Soil erosion is a horrible thing for just a ton of reasons. And it turns out that soil you erode is essentially soil you've taken back, returned to the atmosphere. So what we've been able to put together so far is an understanding how these parts of the water side of the Hudson Valley are working in terms of carbon sequestration. The wetland piece is fairly well documented, and it's expected to provide pretty good benefit from a carbon sequestration point of view. Again, is it going to be hard quantified numbers? I'm not so sure, but there's no doubt that it is happening and it is a benefit. From the open water point of view, it's clear that the carbon that winds up in there is heading back to the atmosphere sooner or later, and so there's not much potential. The key message being, don't let the carbon get in there in the first place. So that's where we are. We're going to keep going. We're going to refine these numbers. There are unknowns. There are things that we know have high variability and can get nailed down. There's new work to be done. But we, the group, is progressing along that way with the thanks of the coordination from Scenic Hudson. So if I'm right, and if my timer is right, we'll take a question or two as you wish. Yes, yeah.
You said that there was, if carbon just runs off the land into the water, it goes right to the atmosphere, there's no storage of carbon in the water for the Hudson. Is that true pretty much with all water bodies?
It's probably true. I'll repeat the question. The question was whether this idea that carbon that gets into the water has little opportunity for sequestration and storage. That is true almost certainly for any large river. All right, there aren't that many places in a large river to store carbon. The places you can store carbon coming off the land are lakes, big lakes, because eventually, big lakes fill in, and they fill in with carbon. The other opportunity is reservoirs, which they fill in with carbon, which would be good from a sequestration point of view. They also emit methane, which is not so good from a sequestration point of view. There's some storage on floodplains. That storage may be long enough to be 50 years, but on a floodplain, the river's going to move back and forth and wind up eroding. So what's the time scale there? It's river dependent. So most large rivers, I think the feeling is that there's not much chance for sequestration. Keep it out of the large rivers.
Thank you.
Sorry. In the back.
Thanks for the presentation. In policy making on climate, we often hear about permanence, verifiability, measurability, additionality. Can you talk a little bit about how these carbon sinks align with those important priorities?
Yeah, so to permanent, again, I don't know what is meant by permanent. If we don't solve the CO2 crisis within 100 years, I don't know what's permanent. So that becomes a little tricky. My rule of thumb has been 50 to 100 years. Verifiable, I think we can do quite a good job of. It's not cheap, right, to go out and measure for any given wetland or set of wetlands or regional wetlands or anything. It would not be cheap to verify X amount of carbon has moved down there and it is now out of action, out of the cycle. That would not be cheap. And I missed, what's your other criterion?
Permanent, verifiable, additional, measurable?
Oh, the additional, measurable I think we're okay on. The additional, these wetlands are doing this anyway, so our action to make sure they can continue to do it, so we don't fill them in, we give them a place to migrate to. There may be times we need to help them with accretion because of sea level rise. And this is almost heresy for someone to say. We might actually want to add sediments to some wetlands to make sure they can build vertically fast enough. So there are things we can do to make sure they keep doing what they're doing naturally now.
Thank you.
Well,
You're making me think about cranberry bogs, which are kind of like open water.
right.
And my organization has been doing some restoration of cranberry bogs, where we did microphotography, bringing plants and stuff. Do you think that converts it to a carbon sink for chance, or is that something we should be measuring?
Right, so the question is about cranberry bogs and how well they might match up with what I've been speaking about here, which are tidal freshwater wetlands. And the answer is they are certainly accreting carbon because in the sediments of those bogs, decomposition is fairly low. What you need to do is not allow this stuff that falls off the plant to be decomposed quickly back to the atmosphere. You want to get it down in the sediment. Decomposition in many of these cranberry bogs will be fairly slow, and so you have a chance to get it down sort of out of the cycle. The part that makes the numbers almost certainly a little bit less is the productivity of those is not as high. You're not producing as much plant biomass that you can then start to bury. And the other thing is with the tidal wetlands, you get deposition of material from the river or from the coast into the marsh, and so you get faster accretion, faster burial going on because they're piling more and more on top. That's not coming from the plants, it's coming from outside and being deposited there. So that's what makes the coastal wetlands, freshwater or saltwater, they're going to have higher sequestration numbers than some of the inland bogs. The bogs are certainly doing it. I think it's worth looking at that as a co-benefit. We shouldn't be filling in our bogs either. So look at it as a co-benefit. Don't think it's going to solve your whole carbon problem. Yes?
I know up and down the Hudson River at various marshes, there's been different proposals around like spraying to kill Phragmites because it's not native and what have you. Seems obvious to me at least that that would have some other potentially really undesirable effects even though it's not native. I'm just wondering if you could speak to how that would affect, those kind of strategies would affect the cycle and carbon sequestration in the market.
Right. So Phragmites is a very good plant for certain things. And it's a very bad plant for certain other reasons. From the point of view of tying up nitrogen or producing carbon that can be buried, it's quite good. All right, so if that's the only thing you care about, you could keep the Phragmites. Frankly, we have enough wetlands that have enough Phragmites around here that we don't need to save the Phragmites wetlands necessarily. And so I think we need to be fairly active about controlling it. And that's not, again, not a popular opinion, but I think it's something we need to be thinking about.
Why?
But no, it is a good plant from the perspective of storm surge protection, wave protection. Some organisms like it, some don't. But again, from a carbon production point of view, and that carbon can be buried, it's not a bad plant to have.
Good enough.
Okay.
Hang on. You haven't made it clear what are the downsides
Of
Phragmites?
Oh, Phragmites, it clearly harms plant diversity. There's no question about that
Thank
whatsoever.
you. Thank you. And ecosystem functioning.
It depends on which ecosystem function you're talking about. Told you it's controversial. Okay, I think I'm confident.
Good job. Good job.
That's Wes.
He needs a name.
Excuse me?
He needed a name. Your friend.
Or she?
Or she. They needed a name.
All right, great, thank you. And thank you for the great rundown of carbon sequestration, so I don't have to do that. Just wanted to give you a brief history. So I'm going to give you an update on our farm data working group. And this group came together a little more recently than the water group. And basically it came about because we wanted to move from discussion and you know, frequent discussions of, you know, these are the sort of things we should do and to some sort of action, because until you get that ball rolling, it's you know, it's easy to just discuss and discuss and discuss, and people get busy and no action items come out of it. So what we wanted to do instead was start with action, even if it's not perfect, and then have that action get the ball rolling that hopefully will build into further action. The goal of the group was to start sharing some of the carbon data that these area farms are collecting independently from each other, not always with standardized protocols that match with others. And I would like to speak to the carbon measurement as well. You know, we're finding that carbon measurement in the soil is difficult. And it's not always accurate. We're finding that often you can submit the same soil samples to different labs and come back with different carbon numbers. And you know, how you measure where you choose to sample the carbon makes a difference, and how many of those samples there are makes a difference. What test you choose to use to analyze the carbon, to use loss on ignition and elemental analysis, you know, an NMR spec. They all have different levels of accuracy. So we wanted to bring this group together, start sharing data, and use that as a jumping off point to talk about some of the challenges of carbon measurement, some of the practices that we're using to try to sequester soil, and having it be a jumping off point for these farm groups to share information with each other. and also to share information, as we heard from the ecosystem health group, to share what else are we monitoring and how can we move beyond just carbon. We kind of came up with a phase 1 sharing, and that's basically sharing our carbon data and our soil data where we are currently. And so the goals for phase 1 were to establish protocols and relationships for the free sharing of soil data between farms participating in NECA. And I should say, I didn't come prepared with a list of farms, so please forgive me if I forget someone, but right now in the group at various times we've had Stone Barns, Glenwood Farms, Farm Hub, Duke Farms, Hudson Carbon, and Stonehouse Farms. Did I miss anyone? That's good. Okay, I think I got it. So the idea was to start establishing a way to share and working out those protocols for sharing. Share data, as I said, where we are now. Let's not wait until we have the perfect standardized protocol that everyone's using in lockstep, because then we'll just keep waiting. So let's share data where we are now, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even have to be complete, but can we start sharing with each other and using that for discussion? Identify and overcome technical and data challenges preventing sharing, and I can tell you, in the short history of the group, we have found those. We have found issues with file incompatibility. We have found issues with a shared vocabulary about testing and about methods. So over the course of our meetings, we've been meeting approximately every month. Here and there, we've skipped a few. Especially during the field season, because everyone's busy. But we've started to find some of those issues and work through them. And then another goal is to help identify data streams that might be missing from the various farms. So as we share data, we say, oh, you know, you have your carbon percentage data, do you have your bulk density data? You know, and these things matter when trying to calculate carbon stocks. And then we can learn from each other's methods, challenges, and data. So a lot of our meetings we talk about what challenges are we having, what you know, what problems with methods are occurring, what methods are we trying out, and how are those working out for us. And then finally, one of the goals was to establish a baseline GIS architecture for each farm. So at Stone Barns, we're leveraging our ArcGIS system to be the host of a shared map of data from all these various farms. And by sharing where we are now, we can start to set up things like field polygons, management data. And then as we move to phase 2, which my colleague Kai Harbour is going to talk about from Hudson Carbon, we have that basic GIS infrastructure in place. We have the sharing protocols in place. So when we get that more standardized data with shared protocols from the farms, we have a place to put it and analyze it right away. So phase 1 progress. So far, we've, you know, the initial sharing attempts have exposed issues, as I spoke about earlier. We have created a sharing protocol and a shared glossary of terms, so everyone understands what we're looking for. Starting with the end of September and going through this month and maybe a little bit into November, I'm scheduling weekly data input appointments with the member farms and doing site visits, and then we're working on getting their data in, overcoming any problems, getting data into the system, if need be, going out with a phone and walking their field borders and getting them into the system manually. We now have a shared database map with data from Farm Hub and Stone Barns, and we are going to be rapidly adding more to that. And I think we would love to share that map. As that map builds out, we'll be able to share it through the NECA website with the community. We've created a Farm Data Working Group story map through ArcGIS to share updates, progress, and maps of the shared data. And as hoped, this initial sharing work has spurred a proposal for a phase 2 of work, which Kaya is now going to share with us.
Thanks, Elijah. So I'm here from Hudson Carbon. I'm talking about the proposed phase 2 plan. So as Elijah mentioned, there's a non-standardized, just getting the work started, beginning to collect data, and what we're talking about now is taking this to the next stage where each farm will be collecting data in a systematic, standardized way. This will be high-quality, ground truth data, and it will further our understanding of how soil carbon is sequestered in the Northeast, what other variables it relates to, how it can best be measured and used in things like reporting for various grants or funding that's coming in to implement best practices in the Northeast. This will also allow comparisons between farms in the NECA and year after year over time on the same farm. Additionally, it'll be a system in which we can invite new farms. So as farmers come in who want to implement best practices, this is an expandable protocol that can allow for inclusion of new participants. So just currently want to touch on the reason for needing ground truth data. There are models that can predict the location and amount of soil carbon, but they're really developed on a regional scale with data that's not specific to farms that are doing things like regenerative agriculture or holistic grazing. They're done on large farms a lot of the times, these big data sets. And they're meant to predict data on a regional scale, so for the whole Midwest or something like that. So when you're scaling down to talk about just one farm, let alone one field, you can get tremendous amounts of error. So ground truth data is really, really essential for this kind of project. So if you're going to do ground truth data, if you're going to do soil sampling, there are some questions that have to be answered. One of those questions is, how deep are you going to sample? There are a lot of groups doing soil sampling and they're only going down a foot, maybe 2 feet. At Hudson Carbon, we firmly believe that you need to sample the soil down to at least 1 meter. There's tremendous gains in soil organic carbon below that top section of soil. A lot of soil carbon is stored down where only the roots are penetrating, and if you're only taking a sample down to a foot or even 2 feet, you're missing out on a lot of the richness of the data set below your feet. So we recommend sampling to 1 meter. The other questions that are really important when you're talking about ground truth sampling are questions of location and sample size. So both of those are massively, massively important. If you're sampling over and over again in a really homogeneous section of the farm that's either doing very poorly or very, very well, you're going to over or underestimate your soil carbon. Also, if you're only taking one sample for 1,000 acres, you really only know what's going on underneath that one sample. But if you're taking 100 samples per acre, you're wasting a huge amount of time and money on something that you don't need. So what we're doing at Hudson Carbon is we're employing a spatial stratification system called conditional Latin hypercube sampling, or CLHS, to answer those questions of location and sample size. Just to give you guys a little bit of information about what kinds of sampling are available if you're not talking about CLHS, you can sample randomly. So you say, I want to take 50 soil samples, plop them down on the area that you're wanting to survey. This doesn't give you a lot of control, there's not a lot of nuance, and it's a little bit harder to extrapolate the results of your data back out. You can also do grid sampling, so you say, I have this much area, I want each sample to correlate to a fixed amount of area, so you're distributing your samples evenly by area. You can also do some kind of spatial stratification system. So this is when you're looking at another variable. So you can say you want to divide your samples evenly between different kinds of land management, between different crop types, property owners, or you can look at something like topography and say you have ridge lines, hill slopes, and valleys, and you want to divide your samples evenly between those different variables. So what CLHS is, very simply, is a spatial stratification system along variables that are known to correspond to soil carbon. So what you're doing is you're looking at something like a clay percentage, where the cation exchange capacity really dictates how much carbon the soil can hold, or the aspect, which is the direction the slope is tilted, which dictates how much sun and warmth the land is receiving. You can look at NDVI, which is normalized differentiated vegetation index, which is a measure of how well plants are growing. You can look at something like wetness. So topographic wetness, which is a measure of where water flows in a landscape, where it's collecting, and places that it's avoiding. So what we do at Hudson Carbon is we look at all of those variables through satellite data, and each of those variables has unique values and unique distributions. And we take those data layers that we created using satellite data, and we plug them into an algorithm. And the algorithm is looking at all of those distributions individually, and it's saying, if you want to take 50 samples, here are the 50 best places to sample so that you're getting the best reflection of all of those different distributions simultaneously. And because the variables that we pick are related to soil organic carbon, it's giving you the best shot of sampling in a place that's capturing the variability of soil organic carbon. And I'm sorry, that was a lot of statistical talk without any visuals, and I'm happy to email you if you want any visuals for that. It's also setting up an elegant system later, once you have the carbon data, to extrapolate that out and build sort of a regression model for where the carbon is on the land as a whole. So this year, Hudson Carbon is developing a CLHS protocol in-house to answer some questions such as how many samples do we need? So the question of how many samples you need is a really important question in terms of real-world access to understanding soil organic carbon. Taking soil samples and analyzing them is time expensive and money expensive, and we need to develop inclusive protocols that will open up this space to farmers who wouldn't otherwise be able to access them if sampling costs are too high. It'll give access to carbon markets and just access to information for farmers about the land, and it also creates a good accounting system for people who are involved in these grants and funding opportunities. So we're currently working with the CLHS algorithm to develop recommendations of optimal sample size. We're also looking into the consistency of results found using this method. So each time you run the CLHS algorithm, you get slightly different outputs. They're equivalent in quality, but they're giving you different locations. So if you run CLHS 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, how consistent are the results found between those different runs? We're also going to be comparing runs using CLHS, 2 methods that we have used for the past 5 years at Hudson Carbon, and will continue to use into the future to compare them in terms of how expandable they are to new partners and new farms, and how time and labor intensive they are. So what this technique requires, and what we propose going forward with phase 2, is that we'll need input from the farms on exactly the land to be sampled, which is what Elijah was talking about with the ArcGIS inputs. And then Hudson Carbon will run the CLHS algorithms, flag the points with GPS unit, take 1 meter cores with our 1 meter coring apparatus. The soil will then be processed, dried, and analyzed in an in-house elemental analyzer. So what are we getting out of this? This is a lot of work going into it. What's coming out? This technique, if it's used at farms across the NECA, which are varied and really well-funded, great examples of holistic farming in a lot of cases. We're also looking at farms in Vermont. It can be developed into a methodology for carbon sequestration analysis, and that can be used later for something like registry approval or for these policy initiatives that have been talked about today. Taking this really big, robust, rich data set to lawmakers and helping to convince them that this is the right thing to do. It also creates a really easy and flexible follow-up reporting system where we can return to the same points year over year and see how things are changing. And again, as I mentioned, it also makes it very easy to add additional farms, include more people in the study. Yeah, that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
We have time for
Do we
some
have time?
questions.
Yeah, a couple questions. There will be a
The red
quiz.
scarf?
Yeah.
There will be a quiz, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Red sweater, sorry.
I was just wondering if you all are connecting at all with similar data collection efforts in other parts of the Northeast, like through Open Team or PASA's benchmark study?
Yeah, I know we are working with Open Team. I know Hudson's working with Open Team as well, so we are part of that effort. I think this will be a regional effort that will tie into the larger effort of Open Team, which goes international, in fact. So yeah, I think it's good, I think, to work at both scales. Kind of have a regional effort that can be a little more personal, and then that database can go into sharing with Open Team as they collect that larger database.
if you're taking samples at 1 meter deep, it took a long time for that material to get that deep. And so it doesn't really tell you much about what's happening now. And if you take samples closer, if you take it at 1/10 of a meter, that's changing from year to year, how far you're actually going down.
Well, it's a little bit different than what Stuart was talking about with wetlands, where the roots of the plants on agricultural lands, especially in crops like the ones that are happening in grazing lands, the roots of those plants are going down into the soil, sometimes beyond a meter, especially if you're talking about the edge of a field where nothing has been done to the plants that exist there for a really long time. So we have seen at Hudson Carbon gains in the soil below that top layer, down all the way to a meter, even if what you intuitively think of as happening is that the soil is getting stacked with carbon. What's really happening is that the plants are taking in CO2, and a small amount of that CO2 is converted into carbohydrates that are going to feed the soil ecosystem. And that's not necessarily dependent on starting at the top and getting smushed down to the bottom. It's happening over time, and it much more depends on the length of the roots.
If I could just add to that, I think I agree with everything Guy said, but also, yes, you are somewhat correct in that the deeper layers tend to be more stable, the upper layers are more labile. But yes, there is carbon going down, and there's value, because there has been some research that showed sometimes when you have carbon changes in that top soil layer, you might actually, some studies have shown that there's actually, you may have an increase in the topsoil and then there's a decrease in the layer right below. So it's good to get that full stratification to look at. Now, do we need to measure deep carbon every year? No. But it is valuable to get down to that level to get at those stable, and where some of those deeper rooted plants, particularly some of our native warm seasons, have actually deeper root structures that can get down deeper into the soil.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. So a question for you too. In both the protocol you're developing and the spatial stratification methodology, I'm curious if you're comparing what you're doing to the protocols set out by, say, the ROC standard or the Savory DOB, because I think the carbon markets are a super important part of this, but also certifications that are already providing that premium to farmers for the regenerative practices you're trying to incentivize.
I guess. I think that yes, the ultimate goal is to compare and contrast between all the different methodologies, and I think even more long term, what would be ideal is if everyone was sort of working in concert to come up with the best and most accessible system for soil sampling, because it is right now widely varied, and if you're doing different sampling strategies, you're going to get different results. So I think in the future, yes, we do intend to work with other groups. Definitely CLHS is something that we've seen come up again and again with colleagues recently. It was developed for the first time in 2006, so it's pretty new on the field, and it's just now starting to get implemented by a bunch of different people that we've seen, and it's coming up more in the literature. So we think it's an emerging space and definitely one of the most accurate ways of deciding where to sample. I don't know if that was a great answer, but...
Yeah, and I think that the protocol that Kai has talked about is very in line with a lot of the methodology we've been discussing through Open Team, which involves carbon credit organizations, scientists, researchers. So it's in line. I mean, they are trying to keep kind of an open framework, again, with this idea of, rather than having farmers kind of resist because you're forcing them into something that's not what they've been doing, like how do we get a framework that kind of standardizes people but helps them work within the chain that works for them. So the protocols that they're putting out are actually multi-tiered protocols, but I think this protocol is very in line with what they've been discussing.